I'm going to pop out quickly and lock the dog out of the room so that she doesn't bug us.
Hey, Bruce, we're live. So could you take your video off and your audio too, please? Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. You are at the flash session panel of 10 really exceptional individuals who are going to be talking to you about legal and policy changes around retreat and some of their experiences. And so with that, I'm Camille Manning-Broome. I'm president and CEO of the Center for Planning Excellence, and I've had the privilege of being on the steering committee for this conference for the past 2 years. I'm going to go first. I'm also presenting and moderating. I will do a quick presentation on our case study in Louisiana, what we've been doing around governance shifts, and then I'm going to hand it over to the next speaker. We'll each go for 7 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So in Louisiana, we are already experiencing a lot of demographic and population shifts due to climate change impacts. You can see just from 2000 to 2010, lots of population movement occurring. As you can imagine, this impacts everything. As we are on the front lines of climate change impacts from sea level rise, inland flooding, and a number of other host issues, one of the major pieces that we're tracking and understanding is, what does this mean from a governance standpoint at every state agency? And so we know within the next 50 years, we're going to have huge challenges to our infrastructure. Estimates are, over 10,000 miles of roadway is going to be impacted, causing up to, $4 billion in damages. We also know that 20% of public schools in coastal Louisiana is going to be impacted. And then also, that hospitals and medical care services, all of these big impacts that provide critical services to a community, we have to start planning for those things now. And this is going to take an enormous amount of coordination and collaboration across agencies, not just at the state level, but also at the regional and local level. So in 2018, we brought our governor and his cabinet together to have a series of conversations around how each agency has a role in preparing our state for the coastal change that's happening and coming. And while this focused exclusively on the coastal impacts, it's an important precedent for how the state is employing a cross-agency planning approach to dealing with the change. This is and you'll hear a little bit more about this workshop, some of the findings in Johan's presentation this afternoon. But what came out of this is we developed an executive order, or the governor executed an executive order to formalize the development of a chief resilience officer and chief resilience liaisons in every state agency. And so the Center for Planning Excellence has been leading this work in partnership with our Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. What we're doing is we're asking each agency to appoint a resilience coordinator. Their role is to represent the agency and contribute to the development of the tools that will help each agency update their strategic plans. We want to build connections to the coastal problem and to each other institutionally, but also we need people to build those connections. And so this outlines some specific tasks for the agencies. Those are listed in the sub-bullets above. These tasks outlined in the executive order support a pretty straightforward process that asks agencies to plan around coastal change impacts. The big picture, that means assessing agency vulnerabilities, developing adaptation options, and then institutionalizing those resilience actions. We'll take each of these one at a time and discuss them briefly. So the first step outlined is assessing the agency vulnerabilities. So we developed a guidance document to help the resilience coordinators work through their agency's particular vulnerabilities in a systemic and thorough way, as well as developed an Excel workbook that they can all use to keep track of the various coastal impacts and their significance. As a first step on our part, and in the anticipation of talking to our resilience coordinators across all state agencies, to get a basic understanding of their mission, their responsibilities, their programs, and how they might be impacted, we did a lot of desktop research, looking at all of their annual reports, their strategic plans, their revised statutes, looking at all of their programmatic activities and other sources. We then developed a spreadsheet that documents where we found intersections of each agency's work with coastal change impacts. And so what you see here is a diagram we made to show how coastal change is impacting a sample of state agencies. So this diagram does not include all of the agencies, and it's here merely as an illustration. So you can see, we started our assessment from the physical changes happening on the coast, which storms, sea level rise, land cover change, salinity penetration. But then we listed out the impacts that result from those changes and separated those out into 4 general categories: infrastructure damage, social disruption, economic disruption, and environmental damage. And as we worked through our assessment, we distinguished between impacts to services and impacts to assets, which you see in the different color lines in the bottom half of the diagram. And that initial research informed the tools and processes that we developed for the resilience coordinators. And so the diagram here illustrates the process we've been using to conduct the vulnerability assessments with the resilience coordinators. So first is a vulnerability screening and is very high level view that identifies the most vulnerable locations and service centers and programs within each agency that need further assessment. The next is the assessment of current and future impacts. And that's where we have each agency start with the current conditions, understanding the current risk to the assets they manage and services they provide. And then from there, they use our Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority's Coastal Data Viewer to see how that risk changes in the future and what coastal change will mean for asset administration and service provisions in the future. And then finally, we ask them to define how significant these impacts are. Mission significance prioritizes vulnerabilities within an agency and across government to identify those most in need of current and future adaptations. So the letters you see in the diagram refer to the tabs in the workbook that we developed. And so this workbook is to help agencies capture and track their vulnerabilities. Here's a screenshot. Its primary objective is to understand the vulnerabilities at the service and asset level. You can see at the bottom, there are several tabs here, starting with the screening, then moving into the asset impacts, both now and in the future, and then service impacts, both now and in the future. You can also see the kind of information we're trying to capture in this workbook. Agencies are asked to describe the particular asset or service, pick from the drop down the exposure that is causing the impact, the location, whether it's site specific, regional or coastwide, and then a description of the impact, and then a score for that impact. And you can see there's a tab with some relatively, subjective scoring criteria. And then there's the significance rating, where agencies are asked to rate how significant the impact is, both to their agency internally and across government. Again, we're really trying to get them to consider the interconnectedness of these impacts and how another agency or agencies might be affected by their identified impacts. And so once an agency knows what its vulnerabilities are, we can, what can they do to address them? So adaptation actions are measures that can be taken to maintain or improve the ability of the agency to meet its mission in the face of the coastal crisis. And then the vulnerability assessment lays out the groundwork for developing these. So adaptation actions might work at different scales and through different implementation pathways, whether at the project scale, through the mechanisms by which certain programs are administered, or through policy changes or legislative changes, but also through new cross-agency partnerships, which is really what we're focusing on heavily. These will look different for each agency, but they are strategies for agencies to get ahead of the coastal change impacts and tailor their services and assets to work well, despite the changing coastal environment. And so in this diagram, we've charted out the different steps in developing adaptation actions. First, identifying adaptation needs, using the vulnerability assessment as a foundation, then define adaptation actions that reduce those current or future impacts, then identify the appropriate implementation pathways for those actions, noting, what required resources or expected timeline is associated with that. And then we're making note of catalytic actions, those that can address the impacts of coastal change across state government and advance adaptation in a more coordinated way. And finally, institutionalize adaptation, identifying the right place for these proposed actions to live within an agency. And so this is the process that we are in now. We just wrapped up focus groups with the agency resilience coordinators, asking them to workshop adaptation action development for 2 to 3 vulnerabilities. And then the questions on the screen are just some of the ones we've used to guide our conversation as we move through vulnerability identification to adaptation action development. These have helped us work through the process, and they've been really enlightening so far. And so we're now moving into identifying legislative and policy opportunities to institutionalize this through law. And we're really excited about all of the work. I think one of the most rewarding things is to see our resilience liaisons in every state agency adding resilience coordinator, resilience liaison at the end of their signature and their name. And so people are really glad to be part of this. When we conducted that 2018 workshop, most state agencies did not know that they had a role to play in this. It wasn't apparent to them. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and hand it over to the next presenter, who is Bruce Hyde. Hey, Bruce.
Hi.
Okay, you're up.
All right. Hi, I'm Bruce Hyde from the University of Connecticut, and I'm going to jump right into it here. Managed retreat, it's not a new concept in the state of Connecticut. After the Great Hurricane of '38, the area of southern New London, which you can see there is pretty densely populated, was wiped out. And rather than rebuild, the state of Connecticut got together with the city of New London and purchased the property and turned it into a public beach and a public park. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with how Connecticut shoreline property works, there are very, very few public beaches in the state of Connecticut, as most the coastline is privately held. I got interested in managed retreat along with my co-worker, my co-teacher, Juliana Barrett, a couple of years ago, and we decided that we would hold a workshop to gauge interest in the rest of the state. It was delayed several times by COVID, and finally we held a virtual workshop with over 130 people signed up for it, over 100 attended. And we had Dr. A.R. Siders as the keynote speaker, and I think many of you know who Dr. Siders is at the University of Delaware. He's working a lot on managed retreat. She did 2 inspiring talks, and the comments that we got back were very positive, including one where the person said that it was the best presentation that they ever heard a scientist give. So you scientists out there, Siders has set the bar. We also had somebody speak about the legal issues relative to managed retreat in the state of Connecticut, and then 2 examples of where retreat has happened in the state of Connecticut, one following Sandy with the NCRS program with the easements in East Haven, and then inland. I don't think inland gets enough play as far as managed retreat is concerned, but in the town of Meriden, where they took an area of downtown that was completely paved over, bought it all out, daylighted a river, and turned an area that was flooded repeatedly into a flood control structure as well as a public park. So with all that interest and the number of people signing up, we decided we'd look a little bit further into it. I sent an email into a number of academic institutions and NGOs, basically that said, are you working on managed retreat? If you're not and you know somebody who is, please pass this email on to them. And this is the response I got back. You can see it was somewhat underwhelming. UConn, I know what's happening. We have 2 professors looking at property values in the area where managed retreat occurs, adjacent to where managed retreat occurs. In the course we teach, we have an exercise instead of a final exam for the students in managed retreat, but that was about it. We really didn't get, for the most part, got no response whatsoever. I also sent out something over Connecticut Planners Listserv to see what communities were doing with respect to managed retreat or managed retreat policy. This is the response I got. To be honest, both in Town X and Town Y, and the names have been changed there to protect the planner. The beach associations have a stranglehold over the issue. Their position has been, we pay your taxes. You will not even discuss the issue. Somebody else didn't want to put anything in an email and wanted to talk on the phone because of the fact that it was so unpopular in their community. A non-starter in my town. At the state level, somebody at DEEP, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, responded that no one is actively working on it. The Governor's Council on Climate Change, there was no managed retreat in the Phase 1 report. The Phase 2 report is due at the end of this year, and to be fair, the Phase 1 report was focused mainly on a climate transportation initiative to reduce carbon. So maybe it'll make it in to Phase 2, but I am not holding my breath. On the positive side, one of the responses I got was from the town of Stratford, Connecticut. And managed retreat, or actually sometimes unmanaged retreat in Connecticut, has been a result of disasters occurring. It's been in response to disasters. And there's been very little in the way of policy. However, Stratford has really taken a lead in this. This is a slide from a presentation that they made to the Governor's Council on Climate Change. And one of their approaches, one of the 3 strategies, is a managed retreat, a buyout program, which in the state of Connecticut is kind of quite remarkable that they're putting that as out front as they are in a coastal community. It's also not the first time. This presentation they made to the Council on Climate Change was over the summer. It's not the first time that they've looked at managed retreat as a possibility. You can see in the December 2016 Coastal Resilience Plan, they identified managed retreat as being a successful strategy for their resilience plan. So with that said, we have very little going on in the state of Connecticut, but where do we go from here? We have sort of set a goal internally to make managed retreat a viable option for a Connecticut neighborhood or an area of municipality when it's considering policies for addressing the issue. We plan to hold a second workshop to promote the conversation and maybe get it before the Governor's Council on Climate Change. We have a fellow from the Lodge Williams Law School looking at the legal issues over this summer. We're going to delve deeper into the economic, environmental, social, and political issues. We continue to want to inspire students through the course that we teach to get them interested in managed retreat. And we are open to any suggestions that people may have about where we should go with this. Unfortunately, I think in the state of Connecticut, we're not going to go very far. It's all going to come down to money and politics, like a lot of, I believe, managed retreat issues will come down to in other states. And that's it. So I will turn it over back to Camille.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruce. And next up is Garry Middle.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Garry Middle. I'm from West Australian Local Government Association, and we're the peak body for local governments in Western Australia. I'm just going to share my screen, and there it is. Okay, and everyone can see that all right? Okay, so and I'm presenting on behalf of Ashley Robb as well. We both work for our local government association. So in WA, or where I live, the state sets the main policies for us to manage coastal erosion, and but we're a very big state with a very small population. So Perth is 2.5 mil, another 500,000 live outside of Perth, and it's scattered population. And really, unlike in some places, our funding does not align our priorities. So we need to make decisions about how we're going to manage retreat. So it's a kind of tricky process that we have. I'm going to talk about two case studies of how we've made decisions in response to coastal erosion. The first one's a greenfield site, and it's a strategic response that we're looking at. So this one is in Two Rocks, and this is my country, Australia. And Two Rocks, as you can see, is over on the west coast, and it's the northern part. There it is up there, right the northern tip of the Perth metropolitan area, which is the capital of WA. So you can see it's a very sprawling city, and so that's what Two Rocks looks like, and it's a very small settlement right at the edge of the city. So here's where the proposed development is going to take place. I'll just overlay what it's going to look like. So it's quite a substantial increase in the population of that area. Whoops. And the way in which we do our hazard assessment is probably quite typical of how everyone does it. We have our hazard lines here, present day 230, 217 and 210. So they're approximates as to where the coastline should be if you take no action in that regard. With Two Rocks, and I'll just show you what the hazard assessment looks like. So there's the town there, and the green is in fact the foreshore reserve, and you can actually see the existing town's going to have some problems in the future, but I'm not going to concentrate on that. I'm going to look further north, and this is the development area, and you can see the green there is in fact the proposed foreshore reserve, and you can see an area at the top there where there's a significant issue in the future beyond about 2050, where there will be erosion accreting into the development area. Now, this is the proposed development, and what the proponent said was that this area here, where the hazard zone is going to start to encroach into the proposed urban area, they proposed what they thought was a pretty interesting solution, which was a special coastal zone to recognise that this area is subject to erosion, and they're going to put in place suitable development controls, whatever that might be, that allow the land to be used within the 100-year planning timeframe as described, but nothing about what to do when the erosion actually hits that place as well. And there's also a coastal node, which I will talk about as well. So there's a decision making. So the state planning authority said, no, you can't have that. All of that land will be reserved, which is in the coastal hazard zone. The proponent appealed that, and the appeal outcome was an interesting one. So I'll just quickly go through that. So all the land in the erosion hazard zone other than the coastal node was to be reserved. The coastal node is a mixed use area, and there was a condition applied by the state planning authority, which was when the shoreline reaches 40 metres from each development within the coastal node, the land would be ceded back to the Crown at no cost. So that was quite a development for us and it's a no-cost option for the government to get that land back. And we're looking at a time frame of about 2080 when that actually occurs. So it's a mixture of avoid and retreat. So that set a nice precedent for us. So that was at a strategic level. The second case study is a place further north of Perth. It's a small coastal settlement. So there's Two Rocks there, we were just looking at previously. And Lancelin is further to the north. And it's quite a small settlement. You can see how small it is. And you can see that it's an embayment. And you can see that even though it's protected by this reef here, so the onshore this way, it's still an eroding coastline. And so they're going to have some problems there. The issue for Lancelin is very slow growth, but what we're seeing is infill occurring in the coastal areas there, not surprisingly. And this particular one was about a development of two houses, this one here and this one there. You can see that it would be in the hazard zone at 2020, 21 and 10. It would be within that zone. And the council has basically no money to do any purchase to get retreat. So they took an interesting approach, which they got legal advice for. And the approach was this, to set triggers for action to take place. There's a 50-year erosion projection, the erosion scarp, an access road, and utilities. And the triggers are set for each of those particular things. So what they did is they set a development condition, and that to notify future owners, there was notices put on titles. So when the existing owners builds and on sells, the new owner would not necessarily know what those controls were. And here they are. This is the notification on the title. And the key part of the things down here, the most landward part of the horizontal datum being within 11 metres of the most seaward part of the approved structure, then they would have to take down all those structures, or a public road no longer being available or able to provide legal access, or when water, sewage and electricity to the lot is no longer available. So when any of those triggers, only one of them needs to occur, then it's a requirement for the owner at the time to actually take down the building and allow the erosion to take place. And the council said they're not going to do a protect option. So they're the two case studies. And I thought I'd just finish with a couple of what I think are some key lessons from those and some outstanding issues. Well, for us, while managed retreat is the preferred option for managing at the coast, we've done very little of it, simply because it's an expensive option. We don't have the money to do that. But you can see with these two case studies that we're starting to see that sort of coming into play. The other one is that we now have two clear precedents, which is helpful for our decision making. But I've got to say, well, what we've done though is leave the tough decisions to later and to 2017 and beyond. So we've made the easy ones, we set conditions. The tough decision is when it actually happens. And we still haven't solved the problem of private inundated land. When that private land becomes inundated, anyone who swims over the top of that land is actually trespassing. So we still haven't solved that problem. And any beach that's there is on private property. That's pretty much me, just some acknowledgements there. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much, Garry. And now we're going to hear from Sara Bronin.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. How is everybody today? Obviously, you can't hear me. Okay. I'm talking today, and I think I just put it in the chat, or I tried to put it in the chat. Maybe I wasn't able to. About a paper called Laws, Disaster, Heritage at Risk, which just came out in the Columbia Journal of Environmental Law. And I know we're just doing short, really flash presentations, but I encourage you to find me. I'm on Twitter at Sara Bronin, and would love to engage with you all. So this paper is about how law at the federal level does not help us to protect historic places from disaster. And of course, there are, as you know, we've heard throughout the week, there are many different aspects or points in time at which law plays a role, before, after, and during, before, during, and after a disaster. I want to focus on just a couple of issues within, again, since this is such a flash presentation, within each of those time periods, and just put out some food for thought for those who might not have thought about historic resources before. So in the category of before a disaster, so in historic preservation world, we typically tie legal protections to designated historic sites, or sites, at least maybe they're not designated, that means listed on a register of historic places, or we direct protections in the law to sites that at least have been deemed eligible for designation. So in looking at in Connecticut, so I'll paint a slightly rosier picture than Bruce, because actually in this particular regard, Connecticut is much further along than other states. So in Connecticut, we actually looked, the State Historic Preservation Office looked at the coast and looked at coastal resources. And here are some images of those resources, and found that there are 32,000 resources that are at risk from flooding related to sea level rise. And these risks, these resources range in from archaeological resources to neighborhoods of historic homes, to much grander, even industrial type historic properties. But 32,000 is a pretty big number. As Bruce mentioned, in Connecticut, we've also done a lot of work documenting the potential phenomenon of sea level rise in multiple different respects. This is what a 1.8 inch or 1 foot, 8 inch rise in sea level. This is the amount of land that would be affected. Zooming in to one town, this is Mystic, which some of you may know from the movie Mystic Pizza, but it's a very historic town, and much of its area around along the coast will be flooded in these future scenarios. I'll skip this slide. All of that is just to say that while Connecticut has at least documented where its historic structures at risk of flooding are, very few other communities at the local level have done so. And as far as I know, no other state has conducted such an exhaustive set of documentation. Unless we know where the historic resources are, we will not be able to protect them from a disaster. We will not be able to identify those resources that have been affected after a disaster in a very systematic way. There are a whole other host of issues related to the way that historic preservation tends to document resources. For example, we do not have a unified GIS map for the local, state, and nationally designated historic resources. And that goes beyond the disaster context, but is really just a matter of record keeping that we really do need to improve in the coming years. So law also plays a role during disaster, of course, because law can either allow or encourage or require, or the opposite, historic resources to arm themselves or to protect themselves from the disaster itself. So in historic preservation law, there are these standards that almost every level of government ties to. They're federal standards, the Secretary Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties. They're a series of very general provisions, and you can see here the standards for rehabilitation, 10 provisions that, again, are adopted very generally. If you look at number 1, a property will be used as it was historically. If you look at number 10, new additions have to be undertaken in a way that they can be removed. So again, they're very general statements, but they have been articulated by the National Park Service in much greater detail. These standards, unfortunately, have not caught up to the realities of climate change. And while we do have some, and just recently released illustrated standards for flooding, so how the Secretary's standards should apply to the flooding context, and how they should protect historic resources. We certainly do not see that the full array of disasters has been addressed, and actually even the flooding guidelines could do a little bit more in anticipating both the relocation of historic structures, which they do not now, and also even the dismantling and repurposing of historic structures. So Without solid standards, though, we get stuff like this that may not be as aesthetically pleasing to preservationists. And we even get communities that may not want designation and the protection that comes with it. Okay. So I think I've said all of this. And then finally, in this very flash presentation, law plays a role, of course, after recovery. So when you do have a major flooding or sea level rise related event, there's a series of processes that must be triggered. When it comes to the way those processes treat historic properties, the federal government's response is pretty inadequate. And if you look at the state and local levels too, there's not a priority given to historic places. Of course, we've talked about buyout a lot during this conference. Another dimension, though, that I just wanted to flag is this question of debris. So when you have historic fabric that has been torn apart, where archaeological resources that has landed on other people's property, there's not really a clear standard for how to treat all of that. So that's another scenario that arises for historic places. So I think that's my 7 minutes. I just wanted to conclude by mentioning that I have another paper out on the Secretary standards more directly, something else on energy efficiency. So all of these issues really interlink, really tie together. And I'm just grateful to hear from everybody else here and to learn from this conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sara. Now we're going to hear from Caroline McHale.
Hi, everyone. Very pleased to be here. I will share my screen. My first job out of college, Barnard College, was at the Earth Institute. So this is kind of it's a full circle experience for me. So thank you for having me. I wanted to talk a little bit about climate change litigation and some of the strategies that are being used in Europe with very sort of expansive interpretations of corporate social responsibility and jurisdiction. I wanted to talk a little bit today about this one case, since it's a short presentation, which was a recent decision in the Netherlands. I am a lawyer, I'm an entrepreneur, and I work with companies, sort of helping them align their strategies with their sustainability goals. I've spent about 15 years working with multinationals and following these issues more closely. And I'm happy to converse with some of the participants about how some of these theories can be used in the managed retreat context. So the case I wanted to talk about today is called Milieudefensie. It's a Dutch NGO that has brought a number of cases against multinationals in Europe. The most recent one that's got a lot of attention, and that is against Shell. They actually have a couple different cases pending against Shell, but the one that I wanted to mention today involves an oil spill that took place in 2004, between 2004 and 2007 in the Nigerian Delta. And the damage was not caused by Shell. The pipeline belonged to Shell, but the damage was caused by sabotage and insecurity, which is relatively common in the Delta area. And so Shell sought to evade liability for many years. The case was brought in 2008, and a favorable decision was reached in 2021 on behalf of the Nigerian farmers. And I won't spend too much time on the facts and the law, because I think the takeaways are more important here, and the implications for managed retreat are worth discussing. The first thing that's worth noting is that the Netherlands took a very expansive view of its jurisdiction in this case. So it basically said that it was competent to hear the cases brought by Nigerian farmers simply because Shell was domiciled in the Netherlands and therefore had the appropriate jurisdictional link for purposes of hearing the claim. That said, Dutch law was not applied. It was actually English law and Nigerian law, which is very much inspired by English law. And what was the discussion, if you look at the court decision, really focuses on what is the duty of care to a multinational in the case of damage, environmental damage. And what's interesting is that it was a very sort of basic tort law analysis that was applied. It was an analysis of, what is the care that the standard of care that's owed by a multinational to stakeholders in a third country without any contractual link. They looked at obviously whether there was an issue, what damage was caused, whether there was a link of causality, and ultimately could the damage be quantified. So it's very I would say strategic on the part of the plaintiffs to use the Netherlands as a forum. And it's very encouraging to see that the Netherlands is open to hearing these types of claims under very basic tort law principles. Why? Because tort law, you don't need a contract to invoke tort law principles. Tort law is probably one of the oldest areas of law. It exists in every country, in common law countries and in civil law countries. And it's probably something that most lawyers learn in their first year of law school. And they're taking a very open approach to extraterritoriality, which is something that, for example, in the United States, courts have really resisted hearing claims brought by stakeholders outside of the United States under the Alien Tort Statute. So I wanted to bring this up today because I think that, we're seeing a lot of robust and encouraging decisions in Europe as to, what is the responsibility of a multinational? Could that be used in the context of managed retreat? I think there would be causation issues, certainly, but it's certainly worth exploring. And the very interesting thing about the Netherlands as a forum is that even if a company is not domiciled within the Netherlands, most multinationals have some jurisdictional link to the Netherlands because it's often used, the BV structure, which is the Dutch corporate law structure, is often used for tax optimization and for treasury management and things like that. So even for a company that's not necessarily domiciled in the Netherlands, there probably is some jurisdictional link. And so the Netherlands could be a very favorable forum for pursuing these types of claims, even against companies that aren't Dutch. So it's worth exploring. And it really shows that, the strategic litigation angle is one that's really gaining momentum. It's definitely not, it's not necessarily rapid. In this case, the Nigerian farmers brought their claims in 2008, and they're just seeing a favorable result now. But it's something that's certainly worth looking at closely as a strategy for managing or for countering the risk of managed retreat. I will stop my slide there up, and I think that that's probably my 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And next, we're going to hear from Barrett Ristroph.
Hello, everyone. Just getting my screen all ready. Give me just a minute. My screen does not want to share. Can you see my PowerPoint here?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, let's take it away. Okay, I'm going to talk fast. So I have worked on the Newtok relocation as well as a lot of other Alaska Native villages that are dealing with climate change, among other challenges. I'll just point out, I have no personal knowledge of the Île-de-Jean-Charles relocation. Other people, probably Camille, have a lot more personal knowledge and have been involved in that. But I just think it's interesting to point out that there's some similarities. My pictures are off here, but you can at least see a good picture of what Newtok looks like. I, at one time, kind of put together a chart of like all the interesting similarities and comparisons. And I won't go through all of them, but it's interesting to note, and these are not the only two communities in this case. These are Indigenous place-based communities that are dealing with a great challenge, especially because they don't have control over the land. They don't have jurisdiction over it like a lot of the lower 48 tribes do. Newtok does have the benefit of being a federally recognized tribe, which means it's better able to get some federal money, whereas Île-de-Jean-Charles doesn't. But both these communities are affected by climate change, and both will be potentially uninhabitable in a matter of time. it can't be ignored that in Louisiana, there's a lot of other geographic stressors beyond sea level rise and severe storms, namely the erosion and subsidence and saltwater intrusion related to oil development. And that's true of a lot of these climate vulnerable communities. There's often more than one environmental stressor, and as I'll discuss later, there may be political or social stressors. Both these communities are somewhat remote, although Newtok is so remote that it's extremely difficult to get building supplies out there, particularly when you consider that a lot of times planes can't fly in due to storms. And that is why a house in Newtok can cost $500,000. And Newtok relocation costs are always jaw-dropping because they cost so much per person. In Southwest Louisiana, Southwest Alaska, there's very little high ground around, which is why the new site's actually on an island and there's not land there that's prone to flooding. It's still in their traditional territory, whereas the island residents are kind of in the midst of a place that's not their traditional territory, and they may have to deal with mainstream culture. But despite not getting a large amount of money, Newtok has made a lot of progress and hope to keep that move going with small grants and having the residents who moved over make housing payments. And but the success of the relocation is really going to depend on these people who already got their houses, staying loyal to the community and making their payments or getting mortgages to support the homes. And you're probably all familiar with the troubles on the island related to the two different tribes and differences of opinion. And this has certainly been a challenge for the move there, particularly with one tribe thinking that they're not going to participate, but the state of Louisiana has kept on moving forward with construction. I'm going to move now to some lessons learned and some general principles that are really general. Every community is different, but some of these might apply to other moves. And I've seen them with the Newtok move, and maybe they're true of the Ile-de-Jean-Charles. I think a lot of people on this talk would agree there's such thing as climate justice, meaning that these communities, any climate vulnerable community, really an individual, I believe is entitled to relocation assistance by the US taxpayers because the US population collectively benefited from the emissions that contributed to the vulnerability of these communities. So relocation assistance, what does that mean? Financial support, technical support, and capacity building to help ensure the maximum participation and control by these people. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I want to say that because that needs to be considered in tandem with some of the other lessons I've learned and things I've seen. Because people who want to take advantage of what I feel is their right to get assistance, they want to come to the table prepared with a few assets. And one of them is community cohesion. It's really hard to move a community if they don't have enough cohesiveness to overcome the tragedy of the commons problem. That is, some individuals taking advantage of assistance and opportunity at the expense of others. And I think that cohesion can really get difficult when the community is already split, like some have left or some are gone and some are already resettled. It also really helps if the community has a common vision. Where do they want to go? And a fair way to decide who moves first. How do you allocate housing? The communities who disagree on what should happen have a much harder time getting outside help. And when help comes, if there's no community vision, relocation may end up being an outsider's vision. Leadership too, I think that's really important. It takes that to build and maintain the cohesiveness and the vision. At the same time, you need a leader who can keep the community together, but also interface with someone who can provide assistance on the outside. And it is not easy for someone, the same person, to have both roles. Ownership and accountability, this principle really covers many levels. One, the people who are giving and spending the money need to be held accountable, both outside and inside the community. I have to say, when big government's in charge, it's hard to control how they spend. I won't go down that path too far, but also big consulting firms, when they come in and start working on a relocation, it can be really hard to hold them accountable. There's a lot of people there. Just in Newtok, the experience we've had there has been most successful working with small shops. You can pick up the phone and reach them there. Once a community gets money, there has to be accountability with the leadership who's spending it. Embezzlement in Newtok by the previous government bogged down the relocation for years. Finally, there has to be a sense of ownership among the individuals who are going to relocate. And it's in part for this reason that Newtok has the housing policy where some people are supposed to pay, once they get over to their new homes, they're supposed to pay for a portion of them. And then that money is used to help bring over the rest of the people. So individual residents also need to be aware of what's going on and participate in the meetings on relocation. If not, again, somebody else's vision of relocation takes hold, and it's really hard to hold those outsider people accountable. So that's the housing policies. It's important to understand that climate change and the ability to relocate a community are just a couple of factors that determine whether the community will still be here in 100 years. You can't lose sight of all the social and cultural, political and economic aspects of running a community. particularly with tribal communities impacted by colonization. There's a lot of lingering trauma, social ills that probably need to be addressed. Nobody wants to talk about it, whether it's substance abuse or something else, but this can end up impeding the relocation or anything else that the government's really trying to accomplish. And in Alaska, there's been some success with setting up tribal courts there who can really manage their own issues themselves and handle their own, build capacity among their own people. There also needs to be some serious thought about how people are going to support themselves at the new site, especially if the old site was already having economic challenges. And this is really problematic with remote or rural communities where there's not really any jobs in the first place. And that is why I think part of adaptation assistance needs to be capacity building, not just adaptive capacity, but workforce capacity or the ability to obtain grants and provide basic services. So just to summarize, I'm trying to say that all the money and laws and programs in the world are not going to be enough to relocate many communities, despite climate justice. People who want to have help, they need to look at the situation. People who do want help on the outside, they need to look at the community, see it holistically. What are all the problems there? What needs to be done besides just physically move the community? I'll say for myself, it's extremely gratifying to see how far the people of Île de Jean Charles and Newtok have come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barrett. And next we'll hear from Ioan Fazey. Ioan, you're on mute.
Thank you. So I hope you can see my screen there. I'm going to open this up a little bit broader than perhaps some of the others have talked about already, but it's quite nice to come in at this stage because much of what has already been talked about really fits in with what this presentation is about. And this emerged from, as Camille said at the beginning, a workshop that we helped run with the governor of Louisiana and some of his senior executives from the government. And some of the thinking about this came out from that as we reflected on really what was happening in Louisiana. So this is the sort of outcome of the thinking behind it. So 3 emergencies. Well, we're in an emergency globally. It doesn't matter whether it's climate change, sea level rise, or whatever. Essentially, what all this means is that we are at the end of the world as we know it. This is quite serious. We're in a fairly precarious position as a species, and managed retreat and the context around that is just one of the examples in that. And of course, Louisiana is a great example in that space as well. It's already been mentioned that some of the issues are much wider than just sea level rise. Land loss comes in Louisiana comes from a whole range of human-induced activities in the landscape. So it's a combination of land loss from that whole region, as well as the sea level rise that contributes to that and the storm surges. And the challenge is enormous. So this is just one image of a scenario of what might be in the next sort of few decades and how much land might be lost. The numbers of people that will be affected by this. This is enormous. This is huge. 2.2 million coastal community residents under threat. 1.2 million impacted by sea level rise alone in this region. This is really massive, and it's not something that is going to be easily addressed by sort of small operations and changes in activities. And for most people, and I think this has already been highlighted by some of the talks, it starts to look like this. And it doesn't matter whether it's just one community, it doesn't matter whether it's a whole region, but you start to look into this enormity of the challenge that people are facing in these regions. And as I say, it's not going to be addressed by single or simple approaches and changes. This was a nice image that came from a bookshop in Glasgow that a friend sent me. Please note the post-apocalyptical fiction section has been moved to current affairs. We might think that 3 or 4 decades is way off, but we know it's already happening. I'm sure most of you know that already. This is not something that we can wait for 3 decades to address because it's already started now. So the question really that got me thinking as we worked with the governor of Louisiana and through Camille's great work in the organization that they have is, well, how can we think about this more effectively? What are we really missing when we approach this sort of challenge? And really what came out of it was a thinking that really we're not just dealing with one emergency, it's actually three. We've got visible emergencies or the manifest emergencies. These are the tend to be the things we're focused on. How do we save somebody from a storm surge, the biophysical climate impacts? How do we help people transition into a new economy as things shift and change? Maybe around low carbon economies as well, but also if you think about coastal regions as they shift, the economies have to literally change as that occurs as well. But then there's another layer and level of that, and that's what we call the conceptual emergency. And we can't address and overcome the enormity of the challenges in the visible without changing things at the conceptual level as well. So that might be just how conceptually are we approaching it. Some examples are coming out already in the talks about having to think about climate from a climate justice perspective, or a different legal approach, or whatever. But we also have to change the systems and structures that allow us to, or constrain us from being able to work in that area. The rules, norms, and governance, that's coming out as well. Assumptions and mindsets and worldviews. What do we think progress is? What do we think development is? What do we think community cohesion is? So all of these things start to have to be questioned if we're going to address the enormity of the challenges at the visible level. But there's another level on top of that as well, because we can't address the conceptual without addressing the existential. We often talk about these things as existential challenges on the basis that we won't continue to exist, literally. Many of these communities won't exist in the future, but existential means more than just existing. It's also about questions about who am I? What are we? What's our identity? What is right? And so the values and ethics underpinning it, the identity of these communities that are being lost is enormous. You know, it's a major, major challenge. It's changing the relationship to land, it's changing the relationship to each other. And so you can't address the conceptual issues without also working with that existential as well. So really there's three kinds of emergencies in there. There's not more details in a paper that we've just published around that. Ile de Jean-Charles has already been mentioned. Moving communities, where do they go? How does that change their nature to land, community, economy, all of those sorts of things? How do we set up the right processes of governance, new laws and regulations and things like that that allow us to do this in an equitable and just manner? So there's a whole range of challenges in there on the conceptual, and then you get to the identity questions in there too. And I think that was really coming out in the workshops that that Camille led and ran around how we might approach that in a new way. The challenges of how do you work across government silos in order to address that those sorts of issues and overcome the essentially the silo-based ways of working for an issue that is highly interconnected that Camille has already highlighted. So I don't want to go into this too much detail, but essentially working with these three layers of emergencies is necessary to do it. But what we're really talking about is a transformation. We have to work with the transformation that is occurring, and we have to learn how to steward transformations, not just to create something and improve something, but actually to come up with a fundamentally different pattern of how we operate. So really, this is the take-home message. Finally, it's not just about managing retreat. It's a transformational process that involves reconsidering effectiveness of outcomes, values, economies, and identities, and ultimately what it means to be human. At least thinking it through the lens of three emergencies helps to draw some of these deep issues out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johan. Okay, now we have Christopher Gaelic.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think one of the challenges of coming later in the panel is that the thing that you were going to present seems a lot less interesting than the things you've already heard. You kind of want to pile on that simply because it was right before. I'm going to kind of build on some of the things Johan said. So taking a little bit of a different tack here, I wanted to get a sense of what does the landscape look like in terms of what I would term as planned relocation managed retreat. So in this conceptual emergency, are we doing the right thing? What does the governance framework look like, not only in these individual communities, but taking a larger and landscape level view across US policy? Where are the gaps? Where are the strengths? Where are we seeing opportunities for policy intervention? Where are we seeing things that may be getting in the way of community-led approaches? But the first thing I wanted to do was to characterize that. And so one of the things that we were looking into was this idea of polycentric governance. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with polycentric governance, I'm going to give the sort of 30-second overview here. It's been around for several decades. Policy or polycentric systems, a term coined by Vincent Ostrom and others, has essentially two attributes you can think about. One being that there's these multiple overlapping decision-making centers that have some degree of autonomy. So as opposed to a more nested system where you have top-down, federal feeding into state, feeding into local, you have these overlapping centers of governance that have their own power to make decisions. The other side of it is that those decisions take into account what's going on elsewhere. So they're actually working with each other or solving problems with each other, or at least taking into account what the others are doing. And the reason this is important is Eleanor Ostrom published shortly before her passing, was that these polycentric systems may have certain advantages for climate governance in terms of robustness, adaptability, innovation. And so there might be some things that make these systems particularly well suited for these problems like managed retreat and planned relocation. So the first research question we had going into this was, given what I had said at the outset, what's going on? What does the landscape look like in terms of policy? But then second, what are the polycentric attributes in these communities that we're looking into? And again, rather than do a deep dive in individual community, we wanted to look broadly across the US. We started with 3 communities, and this is coming up quite a bit. Some of these communities have been featured before in some of the talks that I've seen. But also throw in here, I haven't seen Principal mentioned here in North Carolina, not moving the entire community, but at least critical infrastructure in part of it. What we use is these planning documents that came out of these 3 communities as a sort of key for the entities and the policies that were being mentioned. Again, the idea is, what does the landscape look like from a governance perspective? What are the policies that are being pointed to at the local, state, federal level? And who are the entities that are playing a part in these conversations? And so from a fairly quick scan, we can go into these documents and we can identify, in these 3 plans, we identified 110. This is a rough squarish Venn diagram with all the text circles, the nice circle Venns kind of lost a lot of space. So I did a kind of a square thing here. Across all these 110 entities we identified in these 3 plans, we only found 3 that were featured in all 3. One is FEMA, the other is USDA Rural Development, and lastly HUD. Not surprising given that a lot of these communities were facing waterborne threats. We see that in Principal and Shishmaref, there were mentions of Army Corps of Engineers as well as the U.S. Economic Development Administration. So the other thing that we did was we started to, given this emphasis on polycentricity, start to look at where are these entities based, what's their area of authority, and also what type of organization do they represent? Are they business or private sector? Are they academic or education, government or nonprofit NGO? And again, this is getting to those research questions that I was mentioning on the polycentric side. But broadly, just wanted to get a sense of who is playing in these conversations, trying to take a step back and acknowledging all of those critically important things at the community level, but trying to get a sense from, at the US level, who are the types of individuals that are participating in these conversations regardless of the community, and how do they array themselves from really, really local specific businesses all the way up to international NGOs. And you can see some patterns here, particularly the large number of individuals, individual entities participating in the principal conversation, as well as the large number of NGOs that make up that body of individuals participating. The other thing we wanted to do was look at the policies involved. And again, across all 3, we found 72 specifically mentioned. This range from comprehensive plans at the local level to things like the NFIP. That showed up in all 3 communities. Again, not surprising, but we also see some sharing between Shishmaref and Principal, for example, and NEPA coming up as well. But a lot of very specific mentions in these individual communities. So it's not one thing that's driving the particular show, but a lot of individual things, individual grant opportunities, individual planning requirements that are coming up in each of these 3 communities. Lastly, what I want to focus on is, in my last minute here, is the next step, because I think this is interesting in and of itself, I think, but the more important part is what we're trying to do from here. So after we get these 72 texts, what we're doing is we're splitting them out into individual policy statements, such as this example here from the USDA Single Family Housing Loan and Grant Program. And then we can use semi-automated processes to go in, because this represents thousands of pages of text. And again, the idea is to get a sense of landscape governance. So not just in these 3 communities, but other communities that are facing similar threats and undertaking similar measures, and use semi-automated processes, text mining, to get a sense of who are the individuals that are playing here beyond those mentioned in the plans themselves, using something called named entity recognition. So going into the text, pulling out those individuals. Something called deontics, which frames the nature of the obligations that are contained in these policies. For example, here you have what we would call a must type policy. These are the things you have to do. These are statements that refer to things you have to do. You can contrast this to a sort of a may policy. These are the sorts of things that you might be able to do or you're authorized to do. And you can start to take a step back and say, in this particular community, what's the relationship between things you have to do versus things you should or you can do? How does that change by the entity or the actor that's participating, again, with the ultimate sense of developing a landscape-wide view of what does planned relocation, what does managed retreat look like in the US at the present time? So I'm at my time. I wish I had more time to discuss, but hopefully there's time for questions here at the end.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christopher. Now we're going to hear from Samuel Gelden.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Sam Gelden. I'm a PhD candidate in urban planning at the University of Pennsylvania. And today I wanted to present some of the preliminary results from my dissertation research on flood management in informal settlements in the Philippines, and specifically focus on the option of on-site adaptation and development. Oops, let me put that in the slide. Here we go. So on-site development or on-site upgrading refers to a set of practices that have been around a long time that refer to improvements in basic services as well as land tenure in informal settlements. Informal settlements throughout the global South typically face conditions where there are lack of services such as infrastructure for drainage and sewage, as well as legal land tenure over the land that they're currently on. And this often takes the form of precarious dwellings, occupying marginal land with facing very high hazards. And there are many different forms of on-site upgrading or development. I'm specifically focusing on, there can be very basic rudimentary improvements in public services at the very bottom of this schematic, but I'm really more focused at the top at the potential for comprehensive improvements on site that integrate climate adaptation considerations and disaster risk reduction considerations. My overall research question is really about why governments in the global South have favored on-site adaptation and development less frequently than resettlement, which is really the go-to strategy for managing safety and many other issues in informal settlements. In the interest of time, I'm really just focused on the on-site adaptation component as a potential option, but I'm happy to talk about the resettlement issues and components. I focus in the Philippines specifically because they have a sizable number of informal settlers, up to 17 million nationally, many occupying very high-risk areas to climate and other disaster risks. And the Philippines also has some very innovative strategies and programs in place for both upgrading and relocation and resettlement. So it's a prime area for studying, especially in the capital of Metro Manila. And these are some of the methods that I'm drawing from for this presentation in terms of conversations with technical experts and document analysis. First, I just wanted to build on the current findings from Ioan Du and Stefan Graving in the journal Sustainability, where they actually poll about 36 stakeholders in Metro Manila, from national government agencies to different local governments to NGOs and international institutions about questions about on-site adaptation and development specifically, and why adaptation and disaster risk components those elements haven't been realized or promoted more. As you can see, one of the main takeaways is that disaster resilience has not been a major component of these projects and programs in the past. That partly reflects a lower priority in terms of physical and socioeconomic conditions, especially economic conditions of informal settlers themselves, even with government assistance. In terms of why the state hasn't prioritized it as much, what stakeholders really identified was the issue of land tenure disputes, unsurprisingly, but also, the issue of perceptions around undesirable permanent settlement in a lot of these cases, and that's definitely being threatened to be evicted or have your structure demolished in many of these places is definitely an incentive and a coping strategy for many informal settlers themselves to not invest permanently on site. Lastly, when asked about what factors really hinder this process, an interesting finding that sort of builds on the research that and the conversations that I've had is that it's not really the high cost of land that's really driving a lot of changes in upgrading on the ground, but really when national policies or local government policies are supporting upgrading as well as disaster resilient and climate adaptive measures. Also, significantly, stakeholders perceived upgrading as an expense rather than an investment, which is, a potentially concerning outlook because, it's very easy to expend, a little bit on a very small, microscale project and then leave. But real investment and results actually requires, durable, lasting, comprehensive commitment. And part of that involves comprehensive land reform, as well as a strong participatory element to the process. So moving from those challenges and potential challenges, barriers, and sort of the underlying dynamics, I wanted to present a specific case study briefly to sort of look at how these challenges play out on the ground, as well as what potential opportunities there may be. This is a creekside informal settlement called Estero de San Miguel in the city of Manila. It's about 2 kilometers wide. As you can see in the satellite image, there's a few universities around it, and there are about 160 families occupying the waterways. And this is the before picture, and you can see a lot of the settlements were very, precarious on and along the creek. In around 2012, after significant community organizing, a strong engagement, and political connections from a local NGO, this community was able to achieve a presidential proclamation granting on-site tenure security around 2012. And through a participatory process of land acquisition, site selection, planning, and implementation, they were able to build on site in the very narrow strip of land along the creek. So this was the outcome in a pretty short amount of time. There were 23-story, medium-rise buildings. Each lot is about 24 square meters, and each room is about 16 square meters. These are very small. Each had room was about 500,000 Philippine pesos, and so the residents, the 40 families that were able to live in these buildings were to pay monthly amortized installments over a period of time to pay that off. As you can see, the public investments in the walkway and the sort of pocket parks along the way helped justify the public investments as part of it. And there are also disaster mitigation, flooding, earthquake, typhoon considerations in the building design. In terms of three potential issues that I wanted to flag, while this definitely presents aspects of opportunities to pursue in the future, three issues were, one, that while this site was certified as being flood safe by the national government agencies, and so it incorporated the ground floor as being able to flood and residents would be safe above. There are a lot of other communities like this who were not really given the option or did not have the opportunity or choice to be able to upgrade on site. And so there are a lot of inconsistent policies, technical assistance, and implementation of government of policies, especially from the national level. The second issue was definitely cost. There were 40 families achieved legal tenure. They would occupy these buildings, and they had usufruct rights over the land. However, there were still 80 other families that needed to be relocated and are still not relocated. So the state budget for this project could not match the private sector price for acquiring land in a nearby plot. And so many of those families are actually occupying the first ground floor, which is not supposed to be used for residential living purposes. And so that's not desired, that's not advised. And so that the cost and the affordability is a big issue, especially in making sure the people who are actually in the buildings stay over time and actually continue residing there. The final issue that I wanted to point out was related to the national building regulations for public housing, which are not incredibly detailed or applicable for these very dense sites with very small, land constraints and other hazard issues. These buildings are very, very thin and narrow. And I think there are a lot of technical modifications that could be made, including more participatory components in the design to make it more efficient and make it more and allow more families to be on site. So in conclusion, I think the main takeaway from this case study is that upgrading on site is really an option that should be considered more genuinely at the beginning of the process. That doesn't mean it should necessarily be used everywhere in all scenarios, but I think there's a really there's go-to thinking by the government and the mindset that most of these people need to be relocated without really thinking about the consequences thereafter and the many adverse outcomes that can result in the longer term when upgrading is really overall more cost effective. And then one of the other. Oh, okay.
If you could wrap it up. Yeah,
sure.
We've got one more presentation. Thank you.
Sure, no worries. I would just say that there are some long-term comprehensive reforms that could be made in terms of land management, in terms of state policy, and in terms of in terms of addressing affordability issues. And so I'll leave it with that. Thank you, Camille.
Great, thanks so much, Sam. And our last speakers are Colleen Chan and Devin McGee.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'll try and make this quick. So hi, my name is Devin McGee.
Oh, and I'm Colleen Chen.
And today we're going to be talking about the relocation of renters in managed retreat policy. So we believe that climate-informed housing policy is broken. Specifically, we're talking about things like climate-informed housing programs and policies like green building, resilient building measures, and managed retreat policies like buyouts. These programs and policies focusing on imposing climate-specific measures on housing, which isn't necessarily a problem, but they can shift resources away from delivering housing solutions to the most overburdened populations. Consider, for example, low-income renters who are worried about where they're going to be living next month, not whether or not they have LED light bulbs or a rain barrel installed. These types of policies are designed to protect buildings, but not necessarily protect people. They're designed often for homeowners and not for tenants. And at times they can be viewed as policies that take away from the provision of affordable housing. So what exactly is the alternative? Today, we're going to talk about what housing-informed climate policy could be, why housing-informed climate policy works, and why it matters for managed relocation. Though our research has been conducted through the lens of New York, our findings so far are really broadly applicable. So thinking about affordable housing in New York, there has been overwhelming demand for affordable housing in the city for decades. There are currently over 300,000 families on the New York City Housing Authority's waiting lists. And we know that after Hurricane Sandy in 2012, about 20% of the public housing stock and 100,000 units of privately owned, affordable, rent stabilized or subsidized housing were completely devastated. Low-income rental populations living in affordable housing units were left without heat and hot water for weeks after Sandy, and many of those units have not been repaired, creating low-quality affordable housing stock and permanently reducing the housing stock in the city. We also know that climate change is just making these issues worse. By 2050, we can expect that 4,000 units of affordable housing in New York City will be affected by sea level rise each year. And we know that this isn't just an issue in New York City. Climate change is exacerbating affordable housing issues up and down the coast from Florida to Maine and beyond. In the recent few months, there have been a ton of articles and papers about affordable housing and climate change. But among all of those articles, potential solutions have been extremely limited. So today we'll lay out a framework for thinking about and generating solutions that address the affordable housing crisis and the increasing impacts of climate change.
Right. And through a series of preliminary interviews with practitioners in the housing spaces, we've already learned a lot. In the affordable housing space, they explicitly support overburdened populations and address tenant issues, while in the climate policy space, we often strive to do this, but policies are designed predominantly for homeowners. In the affordable housing space, they've spent a lot of time and money researching rental populations, whereas in the climate policy space, we haven't had that much data especially on the relocation of rental populations. In the affordable housing space, there's been a longstanding institutional knowledge providing and advocating and renters, and in the climate policy space is often seen as a new and nascent field that we don't really know a lot about. And lastly, at the end of the day, of the affordable housing policy world may dismiss certain climate and environmental issues for a variety of reasons. And similarly, the climate policy realms view the affordable housing space as kind of a narrow set of issues and may even be outside of the climate policy scope. So while these two areas rarely meet one another, where they do, we see that there's opportunity. Both are areas of study that impact everyone. They're extremely pressing. They're often siloed, underfunded, and they both impact the most overburdened. So the opportunity that we see is that if climate practitioners are designing for a more just and equitable future, protecting, preserving pathways to affordable housing is a critical component to that future. We have a responsibility as climate practitioners to create opportunities for safer, cheaper, and more secure housing post-disaster and into the future. And we really don't have to reinvent the wheel to do that. So what do we mean by not reinventing the wheel? So we've learned through our research that COVID has been a huge turning point for the affordable housing space. So in response to COVID, new government programs were created that replicated existing processes, such as the new emergency rental assistance programs that were created. All of these programs were quite inefficient. They took a long time administratively, and those processes were new and they were onerous for both advocates and applicants in order to get the assistance that was needed. So affordable housing folks told us that they learned that they push for the expansion of existing programs and processes that already work, especially after a disaster, and they needed to renew advocacy to reinforce a more permanent housing safety net. So as climate change practitioners, we should learn from those same lessons in the affordable housing space. In short, we need to adapt. Given what we've just told you about affordable housing, we believe that relocation and retreat strategies for renters needs to be a bigger focus for climate policy, and also in a way that doubles down on what already works. So research is in its early stages. The potential solutions in the next few slides are a great place to start. And if you take something away from this, we encourage you all to start having regular conversations with housing practitioners as you are going about your work in the climate policy field. So how are we going to join the affordable housing conversation and develop relocation strategies that fit into existing housing policies and programs? So let's take an existing affordable housing mechanism, such as the production and conversion of existing units into affordable housing units. This can be done through an existing program, such as public housing, already works in these affordable units. A housing-informed climate policy might be to dedicate FEMA BRIC and FMA funding for public housing creation outside of the floodplain. So you can see we've created a bunch of these policies under a bunch of different affordable housing mechanisms, such as preservation, direct rental assistance, and tenant relocation assistance. Back to Devin.
Awesome. Thanks, Colleen. So what are our takeaways from this research? First, if we want to address equity and justice, design for tenants, and leverage institutional knowledge in the housing space, we need to start moving beyond conversations of planning, reforming, and critiquing. We need to take a lesson from COVID and join the existing conversation in pushing for a housing safety net and stop trying to reinvent the wheel. And third, we need to create actionable programs for the climate-induced relocation of renters by building on established, effective, and scalable affordable housing programs that can be implemented quickly. So with that, I'll wrap up and we look forward to any questions and comments you might have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so very much. We have 2 minutes left, and so we don't really have much time for Q&A. We are at the end of the session before the break, and if does anyone have any dying comments that they want to make, just to say farewell to our group today? I've enjoyed listening to all of you so much and hearing about all the great work and thought going into this topic. Okay. Well, with that, please contact any of the panelists if you have questions, and we are out of time, and so hope to see you in another session. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Work and thought going into this topic.